Hello and welcome back to the Social Matters podcast. We are three social workers talking about social matters. Hi, I'm Nadia.
Hi, I'm Fran.
Hi, and I'm Eugene.
We've actually got a fourth social worker in the house.
Yeah.
We have got Lisa.
I want to make more noise. I'm like, what else can I
But
do?
I'm just like tapping.
Welcome, Lisa. Welcome to the Social Matters podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
Long awaited appearance.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is like we like Lisa's been. I said Lisa's been trying, like you've been forcing us, but but we wanted to get you on the podcast for a long time. So I think it's a nice wait to have you in person, because I think Lisa Zaranyika in person is way better than online.
Yeah.
Well, yes,
Careful.
but I know. I was like, where am I going?
Oh, I see.
It's much,
Yeah,
it's
okay.
much.
So, Lisa, would you be so kind as to tell us a bit about yourself, a bit about the work that you do, and yeah, just tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Like I said, thank you very much for having me here. And I guess I've done this a few times, where a really helpful way of grounding myself when introducing myself is not just to say who I am in the context of the work that I do, but who I am as an individual. So I think because of the work that I do in relation to like the anti-racist work, I want to ground myself in like who's come before me and what my future is, because that's how I think about this work. So I always start by saying my name is Lisa Zaranyika, but I am the daughter of Alfred and Victoria Williams, both migrants to this country from Sierra Leone, West Africa. I'm also the mother of Aaliyah, Nathaniel and Maya Zaranyika. So yeah, that is who I am. That grounds me. But what I do is I'm currently working as the Director of Community and Culture at Young Minds, which is a young people's mental health charity. I am a very proud social worker. I've just registered.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. Just the deadline's passed.
Well, no, well, wait, but a few days ago.
Don't worry, we were all in the same boat. We're like,
Yeah.
this is my reflections.
And also, this is probably coming out in January, so people think Lisa.
Yeah.
And back. No, I did it in time. 29th of November. Right in time. So yes, I'm also a registered social worker. I'm also a member of the anti-racist movement that I know we're going to speak a little bit more about. But yes, that is me.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you. I love that, like, you know, it's not just me and my name and like who I am now, but like who's come before and who's coming next. Like, it's just so like powerful to think of yourself in that way, because I think sometimes you can kind of, yeah, maybe get too sort of bogged down or focused on the now and not think about the past and the future and the hope and you know, lessons and yeah, like I say, hope that comes with that. So yeah, I just really love that. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa. So would you mind just telling us a little bit about what you do and also what drives your anti-racism work?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I start with like Young Minds and what I do there, what drove me to Young Minds was definitely they have what they call the Jedi. Which is not just a really cool name, but it stands for Anti-Racism, Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. And it's their really unapologetic approach to anti-racism and their centering of anti-Black racism in that work. And so for me, it's the thing that made me think that's really an organisation that I want to go and work for. And my commitment to anti-racism, I think, you know, I hope this episode doesn't become too much of a bigging up of Huge, because he doesn't need it. But
Don't worry, I edit it out. Wink.
but when I think about very early on when we started working together, Eugene, one of the things that he talked about was like, where does your history begin? And not having it start kind of at university. So why I do that grounding piece at the beginning, but it's because when I think about what drove my anti-racism work, that the seeds of that were sown from infancy, from all of my lived experience, from my parents' history of migration, being raised in social housing, being a carer for my sister. Like, there's so many aspects of my experience that led me into this piece of work that only got realised actually as they combined with like the education, so the bits around like my master's in law and also social work. Like the founding principles of that profession are rooted in anti-oppressive, anti-racist, anti-discriminatory principles. And so for me, I think all of those previous experiences came together in the culmination of a social work profession, and then just got fed and nurtured and watered from there. Yeah, I think that's driven me from very, very early on.
Love that.
Thanks so much. And you mentioned in your intro at the beginning about being a founding member of the anti-racist movement, so abbreviated sometimes for A.R.M. So it's a Black female professional-led and allied professionals anti-racist movement. Could you tell us a bit about that and your work within them?
Yeah, absolutely. See the big smile come to my face. You're like, yes. But I think about A.R.M. So in terms of like the founding members, I'm a core member,
Right.
but the founding members, or the founding member is Chantel Thomas. So the anti-racist movement came about because Chantel had just delivered a session at Community Care Live like a couple of years ago. And I think herself and Millie Kerr, who works as the strategic anti-racist lead in Brighton, and Namal Jude, who works for Foundations, were just talking about like the need for a space for people to talk about their experiences. And Chantel being Chantel and being like, let's make this happen, let's get stuff done, kind of put out a call on X, which I'm not on anymore for many important reasons. But she put out a call on X saying like, any social workers who are interested in being part of this, please do join. And she just set a date and people came. It was like that call out. And so I went, actually, I didn't get invited along, Chantel, to that first one, despite
Talk to the camera, will you?
Chantel. But what happened latterly was I was working with Antonia, who works in Essex, who's the anti-racist service manager in Essex. And I said, I really want to come. She said she passed all my details. And the reason that I give that long kind of history of it is because it epitomizes what the anti-racist movement is about, which is it's not about any one single person. It is about those connections, that connectedness, that coming together, that community. It's kind of one of our core values is that community and connection. And my coming into that group, the way that it happened was part of that. And so the anti-racist movement, I'm a core group member, so I'm one of 6 members of the collective who kind of like, I say, we're the engine room. So we do a lot of the work, we do a lot of the planning, we organise things like the conference, the podcast. Yes, we have our own podcast.
Promote away.
But that you know, we've got a book club, so we are the people behind the scenes that drive a lot of that. But it is absolutely a collective of, I have to say, quite remarkable women that I'm really proud to call myself a member of.
Yeah.
And I really love that because we recently attended the 2nd annual conference, which was so well organised, by the way, and so powerful in the sense of the learning that we took from it, but also the opportunity to connect with other people. And when I was like, I've known about the anti-racist movement for a while, but I think the conference was the first time I think I've really properly engaged with it, and it was really making me kind of connect with the idea of it being a movement and making change. Does that resonate with you, like the work that you are doing now as a movement in making kind of change in the social work field?
Yeah, it does. And I think the movement, so we talk about being like anti-racism not being a moment but a movement, and it was a commitment to ensure that this doesn't get lost. So I think that was definitely when we started, I think sadly realising that there was going to come a point where like the homeostasis, like there's always that desire to get back to the status quo and the way things have always been. And there was this sense that we just weren't going to let that happen. So how do you continue to agitate? How do you continue to be a group that's able to take that forward? And I definitely think there is something, I mean, you were both at the conference and it was great to have you there, but like the joy, it's not just about, like this is hard work. It's tiring work, particularly when it speaks to your own lived experience. But there is something about, there's a joy that comes from being around people who look like you, who celebrate with you, who understand that it isn't just about the heartache and pain, but it is about, I think one of our members talked about looking for the rainbows, and it's about finding that joy. So yeah, it absolutely, it feels like a movement that isn't just going to stop here, that it is absolutely going to spread and be more than it is, which is, yeah, something exciting.
Love that. So you're obviously an exceptional and extraordinary person. It didn't even have to pay me to say that. But because of our experience of working together, I know how much you do within organisations and outside of organisations to make change, especially around anti-racism. So there's so much we can kind of pick your brain on. But what we wanted to ask you about is your work around community spaces, because I know that's something you feel really passionate about, and you did a piece of research around the community spaces. Can you tell us a bit more about the community spaces and the significance it has for social workers?
Yeah, sure. So the community spaces are something that Eugene and I worked on. I'm not going to take all the credit for it.
You were the leader. I was just your lieutenant. That's how I see it.
But I guess it goes back to that point, like right at the very beginning, around the fact that I just don't believe that this is work that we're able to do in isolation. I don't think anti-racist work or any kind of work that seeks to effect meaningful change can be done in isolation, particularly when you are from a marginalised group. I think one of the most challenging things is trying to combat that sense of like fighting on your own, fighting against a system that just feels too oppressive or too unwieldy. And so being able to come together with others who are just able to get it, just able to hear your experience, to understand it, to validate it, and to be enraged by it, but to give you that sense that you can to power on, I think is really important. And so the community space was a space that where we worked previously, Eugene and I, we worked to put together for student social workers, primarily for student social workers, but it ended up also being for newly qualified social workers as well. And then because of its success, people didn't want to leave, so it ended up being for alumni as well. But it was great insofar as what we were able to offer people was an opportunity to come together once every 4 weeks. And they were students and newly qualified social workers from racialised minority backgrounds who were able to come and talk to some of their experiences of racism, of isolation, of feeling not belonging, in a space, like I said, that people just got it. So the number of times, and where people would come and talk about an experience, and they would look at their peers, and their peers would be like, I can't believe that happened. And they were like, you too, like you got it. You understand why that wasn't okay. And then to unpick it and make sense of it, and to have people say, I'm sorry that was your experience, or that was really wrong, and have that validated. I think you underestimate the power that lies in that. And a lot of critical race theory talks about the importance of voice and being voiced, and the power of giving voice. So I think for me, those community spaces are so key in being able to achieve that, and particularly within social work. So I think in social work education, we are so used to talking about working with minoritised communities and how best to work in a way that is culturally humble. Absolutely, I support that. But it's almost as if we're operating in a world that isn't one that our practitioners are also operating in. And I think that's part of the challenge, is you're talking about experiences that are also the experiences of social workers, student social workers, newly qualified social workers, but not recognising that that's the impact for them. And part of the research that I did highlighted that actually student social workers, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent, but particularly student social workers, they occupy a really tricky space between social work academia and the social work profession, both of which are being gatekept, and both of which are sites of white supremacy, both of which are sites of whiteness. And so they're desperately trying to navigate two intersecting sites of oppression, with whatever intersecting aspects of their identity. So yes, their racialized identity is one, gender might be another, sexual orientation might be another, neurodivergence, disability. So for us, those community spaces were a space where they could come and talk about all aspects of who they were. And that was something we were really intentional about, was that it had to be a space where, yes, you could talk about your racialized identity, but you could also talk about the different aspects of you. So we weren't, I guess, repeating or perpetuating some of those spaces that are created outside, where you're this one monolithic group and all experiences are the same experiences. And I think why it's so important within social work, particularly for social work students, is because if that voice, if that activism, if that commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression is quelled or quashed, or you lose your voice in your student time, where are you going to find it again? Like, and then how do you advocate for those families that you've come into the profession to serve? So yeah, I think the community spaces are such a powerful and important space.
Love that.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Like, just the complexity and but also power that sounds like comes from those community spaces of, you know, bringing all aspects of self to it. And I liked what you were saying earlier about, you know, that homeostasis, that actually, you know, it kind of that fight to resist going back to the status quo. And I was just like holding in mind that, you know, that there must have been some challenges that came up when kind of trying to create the community spaces. And I just wondered, what were there challenges in setting up those spaces, and if so, how did you manage them?
I know it was easy peasy.
Next question.
Exactly. Let's move on. Yeah, I think especially for something that's not been done before, not that it's never been done, but not been done in the context in which it was being done, there's always a worry. And I think the one that always tickles me is that sense of, oh, but you can't give up that. If you give that space to them, then what about the other people? Like that, that's being exclusionary. You're excluding a group. And yeah, I think something, I'm really trying to resist giving Eugene quotes. It's like, but there was that point of, but these spaces exist everywhere. Like they exist everywhere for white students. Like that's the world in which they occupy. So it's creating something that is, yes, it is unique, but there's that quote, isn't there, about when you're used to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. But very much that, I think, and trying to get people to buy into that when it feels so risky, I think is difficult. So there's that. I think when people are worried about it, worried about how it could look, worried about the critique that could come, when people are used to centering whiteness, I think it is then really difficult to kind of navigate those spaces and say, okay, A, can we have the space? B, can you help us promote it? Please, can you give us the time and resource? And I think a lot of, initially at least, it was definitely time that the facilitators of that group were given in addition to their daily kind of workload. And that can be tiring. And I think that's my experience of doing this work generally, is it's always time you have to find on top of what you're already doing, because nobody's going to give you that space to disrupt. I think it's also, the work is hard. So I was blessed to work with a group that we needed to debrief afterwards. It wasn't just you turn up, you facilitate a session and then you walk away. So creating that time to debrief afterwards, but also like your own emotions that come up. So sometimes we would be in a space and we would hear things, and we know that racism exists. We know it's out there. It's part of our everyday, but it didn't take away from that. It hurts. Yeah. It hurts to hear that people are being treated in that way. It hurts to hear that in a profession that overall I'm really proud of, that there was still the capacity to perpetuate that in 2023, 2024, post George Floyd. Yeah, I think those are some of the challenges. Keeping yourself whole and safe emotionally, psychologically.
Yeah. And it's and that idea of we all love Maya Angelou on this podcast, which is great because you always talk about her as well. But you can't pour from an empty cup. And before you started talking about the emotional strain, that's one of the things that I was thinking about. And I know in the kind of facilitation and running and supporting of the community space, you also did a lot outside of those spaces to support the students that we worked with. And I guess, and I was also, I think a question I'm curious about is how do you re-energize yourself, not only within the community space, but with the anti-racism work and things like that, if it does have a toll, or when it does have a toll on you as an individual, how do you like recharge? How do you re-energize yourself?
Yeah, I think it's part of what we've spoken about before in terms of like, what's your theory of change? Like, I don't think that this is the fight against racism is one that's going to be won in my lifetime or in the lifetime of my children. You know, given the recent election results, I don't think it's going to be in America. I don't think it's going to be in the lifetime necessarily of their children, but it's what are you doing to create that shift? What is the change that you're doing day by day so that in generations to come, it will be better? And I think that focus helps, because I think otherwise it gets really tiring and it gets exhausting. But that knowing that the change will come and that it is being affected. And I think what's really helped to regenerate and in this work is to know that it isn't just you. Even if you're in the role of, say, a facilitator, the amount that you learn from the people who enter that space, what they teach you, and then what you see in their growth, I think that energizes me and that gives me hope. And it's hope. And I think I'd read, so you guys know I love a quote, but like hope as a form of resistance, because that's how you get downbeaten if you don't hold on to that hope. And so, like, yeah, my kids re-energize me and give me hope. And my youngest in particular is really committed to anti-racist work. So she's recently won a speech. I have won an award. She couldn't attend, but she was at the Houses of Parliament and she'd read a speech about like police brutality and that complexity of being told by society that the police are somebody that you're supposed to trust, but then also being given signals of this is how you have to behave if you come in contact with them, and own experiences of times in which they're not always, honouring that trust that's given. And I say that because I feel like she's got the baton, like she's going to take that work forward. I really trust and believe that she's learning. And so I think that energy comes from not only the building on the past generations, those who've come before us, being present in the spaces that we create and the work that we do, but also having the trust, hope and faith that that's going to be taken forward in the next generation.
Well done to your youngest.
I know.
Mum and her daughter.
I know, and love that, idea of hope. And also your children, because I feel like I've known them for years. So I was like, come on, winning the award. I love that. So, I suppose you've spoken a lot about your work very much being within the grassroots movement. And I loved actually your kind of story of the development of A.R.M, because it feels so grassroots. The call out. It's that sort of like I went to see when Bernardine Evaristo won the first Black woman to win the Man Booker Prize, and she spoke about grassroots movements, back in the day when it literally was, like a poster and a call out and kind of people together. So it really kind of has that lovely idea of a movement. But what would you say are the three or biggest barriers to grassroots movements and kind of keeping them alive and developing, and how you may overcome them, or any advice that you'd give to overcome them?
Yeah, I think it is that even grassroots movements have to operate within a space and a world that is not designed for them to thrive and grow. And so I think it is trying to honour yourself and the originality and the innovation and the purpose of those groups, whilst also trying to access what you need to access to be able to grow. So thinking specifically around funding, I think try not to dim your own light or speak to a purpose that is not yours to be able to access the funding that's going to enable you to grow is really, really difficult. And that's definitely something that we are looking at and trying to support. And particularly in the context of it's a movement, not a moment. So there was definitely a moment, maybe a few years ago, 4 years ago, immediately post George Floyd, where there would have been much more funding. People were on board with that. But as I said, when people are starting to move back to, we talked about this enough, we've spent 2 years looking at this, it's not fixed, let's move on. Like, I think it becomes harder to then access that funding and keep that momentum up. So I definitely think that's a challenge, is that the structural, systemic, institutional nature of racism means that as a grassroots within that, if you think about the imagery of grassroots, like that shoot trying to come through the concrete, it's really tough terrain to navigate. And looking at the places, where is the sun shining? Where do I get my water from? I think that's, that just needs more intentionality. I think that's one. I think the second is not to assume that it's going to be a linear process or smooth sailing. And I think there are definitely group dynamics, and it's Charity Not So White wrote a really important paper looking at how, like, grassroots organisations sometimes fall because they almost get caught up in that point around it's so important to be validated and so important to have people recognise your story, but we're not monoliths. We're not one homogenous group who have the same story. There will be disagreement. And I think it can be difficult when you find a space that is so powerful, so important, to then air that difference, because you're like, then what happens if I'm excluded and I lose this? So I think trying to create an organisation, a group that will create space for that difference and create space for that rupture and repair and healing, knowing that that's where the power lies actually, in the capacity to do that. But it can feel quite scary. So I think that's definitely, in a grassroots movement, almost trying not to kill it off before the grass grows properly, is number two. And then I think number three, look at me pretending like I didn't write them down and trying to remember.
I was like, you've done so well with 0 notes. I was like, oh, just.
But I think number three is time and space. And I think back to what was the challenge in relation to the community space. Like, we talk about time as a resource, and that is trying to do it on top of full-time jobs. Like, the core group, we've all got full-time work, we've all got families. And so trying to do that and hold each other accountable at the same time, being compassionate to the fact that we've got other demands going on and trying to get this to happen, I think that's really difficult, the time, but the space. Back to that, because it's hard. And we had an experience where we went away it was a really lovely few days, a bit like you guys do when you go away and have those planning sessions. And we noticed that we were talking about everything, but we didn't want to talk about the experience of racism, because it was like we didn't want to poison that space, the beauty of that space, by talking about something so painful. And yet you have to, because that's the work you're doing, that's your purpose, right? So I think sometimes intentionally creating that space is a challenge, but one that you have to go back to, because that's the work.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Such powerful answers, and it's kind of bringing us to the end of the episode. Final question for you. We love time travel on this podcast. So if we were to get into our time machine and fast forward ourselves 10 years down the road, and the work that you're doing and others are doing around anti-racism was to be successful, what do you think the impact would be, not just on social work, but also wider society as well?
Yeah, I think back to that point of, it's a really tricky question, because back to that point of, this isn't work that I think is going to happen like quickly. Like 400 years and a whole system of capitalism that's built on the basis of that is not going to be undone quickly or in 10 years. But then going back to that idea of, like, what is your theory of change? There has to be some change, right, that's measurable within that time. So I think for me, it would be that we would have much more literacy around the origins of race and racism, and be able to talk about it much more fluently and confidently. I don't think there is enough knowledge, like academic knowledge, but just the language to talk about it, and language that means that you can meaningfully engage and debate. And I also think that what we don't have, I think when we talk about anti-racism, whiteness is centred. So there's an assumption that we're talking to white people about anti-racism. I would really like to see us having conversations about anti-racism with black and brown people, which talks about colorism, which talks about the caste system, which talks about faith, which talks about that really we can talk about and learn about it from our perspective. That's not something that is kind of given to us. I think that is the key to ensuring that we grow, our growth, our knowledge, our future is secured because we're able to have that understanding of what it means for us. So not just anti-racism as a system, as a way of thinking to change a system that in my mind isn't broken. Like the system's working in the way that it's intended to work. It isn't broken. And, you know, to quote Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So it is about thinking about how do systems, how do groups, how do people outside of the system work and equip themselves for when that moment returns, because sadly it will. The moment will return, there will be something that opens up. And again, back to kind of critical race theory that talks about interest convergence. So the idea that it is only when the interests of the dominant society converge with interests of minoritized people that you'll see change. So it is, in that 10 years, we should be in such a strong position that when that point of interest of convergence comes, there is no choice but for there to be a change. That is what I would like to see in 10 years' time. So if you could just get me my little time travelling device, let me see if I'll come back and tell you.
Let us know how it goes. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Lisa, so much. It's so nice to just hear you like speak. You just speak so beautifully and passionately about your work and the space. And I've already taken so many quotes that I'm going to like run with. I love that. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for blessing us and coming down and spending time. If people wanted to find you, where can they find you online? How can people
want to find you?
Yeah, sorry. Not at your house. Yeah, sorry. So if people wanted to follow your work and find out a bit more about A.R.M, where can they go?
Yeah, so please do follow Anti-Racist Movement on LinkedIn. We're also on Instagram. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, you can, Lisa Zaranyika. Have a look for me there. I accept, I'm not going to say all follows, but yeah, I do.
Lovely.
So please do.
What's the criteria then if you don't accept all followers?
As long as your surname is not Ogbuele.
We're already connected. Sorry to my siblings. Lisa's not listening. And my mum.
I will definitely accept Auntie.
She hasn't got Lisa.
Lovely. Thank you. So we have been 4 social workers talking about anti-racism and lots of other things. So you can find us on Instagram at Matters Podcast. You can also find us on LinkedIn at Social Matters. And please do, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please do share it far and wide with your networks and come back and join us soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.